This is Dan Lilker,
And Dave Hofer.
and you're watching Richard Metal Fan.
Hey, what's
All
up,
right.
guys? Episode 301 of Richard Metal Fan Interviews, calling from Zoom, and I'm here with Dave Hofer and legendary bassist and thrash metal Dan Lilker. Played with Anthrax, Stormtroopers of Death, Nuclear Assault. Yeah, it's probably a plethora of other bands I would take forever. So, how are you guys doing today?
Pretty good, personally.
Good.
But it's so great to be able to have you guys on. So you got like this new book, Perpetual Conversion, 30 years and counting in the life of metal veteran Dan Lilker. So how did the idea come to be to sort of make this book?
Well, it's not at this is the second edition of the book. The book originally came out 10 years ago on my 50th birthday, and then now that I'm an old man and turned 60 a couple of weeks ago, we did another edition of it because the first one was out of print for 5 years. So this new edition has a couple of additions. It's got a forward from Thomas Lindbergh from Out the Gates, and it's got a new color pictures from some stuff I got up to this year, etc. And how the book basically came about is that Dave and I met when he was doing merch for my old band, Brutal Truth, when we did a UK tour in England in 2007, because he lived in the same city as our vocalist then, Kevin. And Dave, you tell the story. I always tell it. We've been doing
Well, it does start that way. And then, yeah, they did a European tour the following year, February of '08. And, just there's a lot of time to kill. And Danny is a wealth of, just fun stories and metal history. And at some point, it was suggested, like, dude, if you had a book, I would read that book. And Danny was just like, I don't know that I would ever sit down and like take the time to do it. So when we got back from the tour, I hit him up and was like, yo, I've got some writing experience. I've never done anything like this, but if you're interested, I would be willing to give it a shot.
All right. All right. And considering like there's so many like different like rock star books, autobiographies and stuff like with when making this book, did you wanted to sort of follow in that kind of same vein, or did you wanted to try something different that I don't think really any autobiography book that has never done before?
Yeah, well, one thing that Danny and I agreed on early is that there should be pictures throughout the entire thing, not just like three sections, like, one, two, and whatever. I don't know, like three parts, like in the middle of the book somewhere. That's no fun. And I came up through writing for zines and didn't really feel the confidence to write like a straight biography like you're kind of referring to. So I just stuck with what I knew, which was, kind of like the Q&A interview format style, and interviewed the shit out of Danny and assembled the narrative that way. So yeah, we did want it to be something, a little bit more exciting. That's why the format, it's like 8.5 by 11, so we could get some big like full flyers in there and some big pictures. And yeah, that's kind of like limiting when you have a smaller book. So
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, like because like you take like the extra mile and a half to make it almost like a magazine, kind of like with Parader and like Metal Hammer and stuff back in those days. So I think it's really a creative kind of like idea from a creative standpoint.
thank you.
Yeah, yeah, and in you guys' opinion, like what's like your favorite like old school like heavy metal magazine from back in the day?
Oh man, this I mean, if you want to say magazine, like something that would make it onto the newsstand, then of course, I mean, there was stuff like Metal Forces back then that was super cool because Kerrang was cool for a while because but then they started like getting a little more on the commercial side and a less like, but that's the kind of magazines I'm talking about. There's of course a lot of cut and paste underground staple zines that were like really classic back then, like Metal Mania and Kick-Ass Monthly. So it really, I guess it depends on what level you're talking about. But if you mean ones that were more easy to find, like maybe at newsstands at Barnes and Nobles or at the mall or something, then I had fond memories of the Pit and Metal Forces and all sorts of shit like that. SOD magazine, not the band, the magazine and stuff like that.
Yeah. What about you, Dave?
It's funny. I also like Sounds of Death, but I would give it to probably Metal Maniacs, and then if I was to get an import, it would probably be Terrorizer.
Yeah, I definitely like Terrorizer. I also like the Metal Hammer because I know they're mostly in the UK and there's also a version in Germany, but I know they also got some in the States. We also get it too. And I remember I also loved like the Hit Parader magazines back in the day, which I don't think they're around anymore.
Yeah, I was trying to shoot for actually like older ones. I remembered from my upbringing in the 80s. Of course, the Metal Maniacs was great, but I was going back a little further, I guess.
All right. All right. But still talking about the book, like I guessing for you, Dave, what's like the most like surprising thing you've learned, like when talking with Dan about like making this book? Is there any like stories that you first heard that are like, wow, I never knew this?
Well, I mean, all sorts of those because it's like I had a working familiarity with, some of his bands, but not all of them. I would say one of the more surprising, just sort of topics was, I knew he had an interest in like the New York hardcore scene. I didn't realize because I was pretty unfamiliar with Nuclear Assault, not being a big thrash guy, how tied to the hardcore scene that band was and how sort of integrated Danny was to that scene as he's mostly known as a metal guy, quote unquote. So yeah, and I'm a Midwesterner, so and a little bit younger, so I was just the New York hardcore scene was like something I know the big bands, of course, like your Gorilla Biscuits or your Youth of Today's or although Gorilla Biscuits I think was from Connecticut or something maybe, but I don't know. You, you
Yeah.
know what I mean. But yeah, so it was very interesting hearing just his tales and sort of recollections of the hardcore scene from the 80s. I mean, he was there at the beginning.
Yeah. And how did you two first meet, by the way?
That would have been on that tour in 2007 when Dave did merch for Brutal Truth on a tour of the UK. So I think we would have first met at like Newark Airport, and Kevin
Yeah.
like, "This is Dave. He's selling shirts for us." Hey, dude.
That's
Yeah.
exactly how it happened, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what was like y'all's like first impressions of one another?
I said, I don't know. I mean, it would have been different for him because he knew who I was, and I just met this dude named Dave and said, "Oh, he seems pretty cool," and turned out to be true. And yeah, rest is history, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Danny is right because I obviously knew who he was. It actually kind of dawned on me right before we met, like, oh, wait a minute. This is the guy from SOD. I was so like hyper fixated on the Brutal Truth thing. And then I was like, oh, I'm going to be in a van for a week or so with somebody from SOD who I loved. And yeah, so I was a little like starstruck, but then, touring is not exactly glamorous. So it was, everybody was pretty much on an even playing field pretty quickly.
Yeah. And I guess for you, Dan, because you played with so many different bands, like going from Anthrax to Nuclear Assault to SOD to Brutal Truth, all kind of different bands, like mostly like thrash metal bands, like grindcore, death metal and stuff. Like, how different of like a mind frame is it depending on the bands that you play with? Are you allowed to like bring free reign to like the different bands that you're involved with, or do you have like a certain mind frame depending on the project?
Well, I mean, I'd like to think I've always had free reign over everything I do because not that I'm a control freak. I just mean that I've always just done what the hell I've wanted. But it is true that playing, especially live with bands, I mean, maybe SOD and Nuclear Assault was a little closer because they were both in the thrashy thing. But then with Brutal Truth, at the end of, about two or three albums in, we just got completely strange and complex. So that required I don't know, maybe I'm not phrasing that right. When you're playing live, it's like a different mindset, but it's just because it's hell of a lot more intense. And it's, I don't know, it's very hard to actually put into words. It's just a different feeling or something like that. But, just as equally as fun. I mean, when I went on tour, when I was in Venomous Concept for a while, I just got to go out and play some punk rock with my friends. And then that was like one of the easiest bands I played in. I'm like, no, now I can have 6 beers before I go on stage or whatever. But yeah, it's every band's had a different approach, but that's because the music was different. And I don't know, Brutal Tuesday, we could play like 50 songs in a fucking hour or something like that, and other bands I couldn't. So it
Yeah.
just,
And before Napalm Death.
yeah, right. So again, it's just more just like a different feeling, I'd say.
Yeah. And talking about a couple anniversaries, because this year does also mark 40 years of Fistful of Metal by Anthrax, as well as 35 years of Handle with Care by Nuclear Assault, as well as 15 years of Evolution through Revolution by Brutal Truth. With all these albums, like, because I know that with anniversaries, because I know this year's also 20 years of Blood Derelium by The Ravenous. So how do you feel about those albums now versus when you first put them out? Do you have like a different kind of like mind frame with those albums now, all those years later?
Now I have to remember all four of those. Um, no, I mean, sometimes when you go back and revisit something that you were on a years back, because you haven't listened to something for ages, and then let's say you're at a party with some people and they're like, hey, we're going to put on one of your records. I'm like, well, that's awkward. But then you hear it and you're like, wow, because sometimes when you make a record and then after you listen to it, because you get too uh, obsessed with the production, sometimes you're never satisfied. And then you go back and listen later and you're like, oh, this album sounds fucking fine. What was I worried about? But um, mostly once I've done a record, I try to make sure I'm completely satisfied with it and won't be able to go back later and say, I wish I had done this and I wish I had done that. So it's it's mostly it's just the same kind of feeling just years later, like we did a record and it is, wild though, just the anniversaries of some of these records, from 40 years ago with Anthrax to, the Brutal Truth comeback record. That record, we wanted to make sure because people knew that we were dudes in their mid 40s. So we said, if we're going to come back, we have to make a record like a fucking hammer, just be 99%, alien blast beats. So that's what we did.
Yeah, and talking a little bit about your bass playing, because I know you've heard your fair share of bass player jokes and memes and stuff, but I also find like with your bass playing, you don't gravitate towards any flashiness, but I feel like you find ways to link what the guitars are doing with the melody and what the drums are doing with the rhythm, but in a very kind of creative sense. So when it comes to like tracking bass, whether it be with like Anthrax, SOD, Dave Brutal Truth, Nuclear Assault, Salt, do you, Salt, do you, Salt, how different of it is it like playing with all the like your those bands and like is there a certain mind frame to like tracking bass with those bands?
I mean, it's really just about the song, whatever genre it is. I try to like have a happy medium between playing all the riffs, but also making it sound interesting because the bass is a unique instrument that, as opposed to a guitar, if you have to do chords all the time, you have a limited number of chords where I can hit as many notes as I want because they're individual notes, so there's more of them or whatever. It's hard to describe it like that, but I mean, actually, with the most interesting bass playing I feel like I did was in the when I was playing in the Brutal Truth with the grindcore stuff, and then I've played in two different, like straight up black metal bands, one in the 90s and one 10 years ago in Rochester, which would have been Hemlock and Nocturnal Hellstorm, because with that stuff, you can do this really creepy, eerie counter harmony melody things, and that would have to be heard. I'm describing them poorly, but again, it's just whatever the song calls for, in my opinion.
Yeah. And back to talking about the book, I also love how there's also some like contributions from like even like extreme artists like Fenriz and like Ross Dolan from Elation and a lot of stuff. But thrash metal became like big really fast, especially like in the 80s and stuff. With that sort of like thing, because I know that would like influence a lot of like the death metal bands, even black metal bands that come out in the 90s. How was this sort of like the commercialization of the, I guess, like the music which attracted the sort of you to sort of like more of the extreme subgenres that would come in like the 90s and so on?
Well, I mean, commercialization could be like a two-edged sword, right? Because some people might say that commercialization would mean something that would just get trendy and popular and lose its original fresh, crazy vibe or something. But I know what you're talking about. So, I mean, I'm going to have Dave have a crack at this too, because I knew he grew up in the 90s. But what I would say
Hmm.
is that yeah, when we were doing thrash in the 80s, we were influenced by a lot of new wave British heavy metal stuff, and then you just kind of pass it along. So black and death metal bands were influenced by, albums I was on, I know, and it was because it was they were a couple of years younger than us, so they're at that age, you're 15 and you're hearing this or whatever, and it could be, very influential to you, but then you're taking it up a notch, just like we had done, in the mid and late 80s. So, sure, I think that without the particular evolution of metal with bands like Metallica and then Slayer and Anthrax and stuff like that, yeah, I mean, you wouldn't have ended up with Mayhem and Cannibal Corpse. I don't know what you would have ended up with, but what do you think, Dave?
I mean, in terms of like the commercialization aspect, I agree that that's a double-edged sword because yes, like on one hand, I'll use a very non-metal example, but I grew up more into punk and metal, but when Green Day got big, I took that personally, when I was a
Yeah.
teenager. They were
Like
like,
Dookie is a classic album too.
yeah, I love that album, but like my sister and I were listening to the albums before that, and they were kind of like, not our thing, but like, it felt like our thing. And then when, every kid at my high school had, the Dookie tour shirt on, I was just like, that like stung a little bit. At the same time, when any sort of music, be it Green Day or, Morbid Angel or whoever, is brought to a wider audience, then that's good for the band and more, gets like more ears on it, and then who knows who hears it that then puts their own spin on it. So I just try not to get too hung up on it. I kind of don't believe like in guilty pleasures. You just like what you like, and if it's
Yeah.
popular, great. If it's not, whatever, as long as it resonates with you, that's really all that
Yeah,
matters.
I agree. Because I have like some, I guess not guilty pleasures, just stuff I would like that like some people would say would be weird, but I'm like, fuck what anybody says. I just like what I like.
Hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't have gotten where I am today by worrying about what anybody thinks. So,
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I'm guessing talk for you, Dave, because I talk it for the book, because I know you talked we wrote with wrote about like like Dan stuff. But if there's any other like artists that you would like to write a book with, who would you like to choose and why?
Oh man. I mean, one that always comes to mind, although it would probably be kind of a interesting experience, would be Trey from Morbid Angel, just because they're one of my favorite bands, and
Hell
the
yeah.
guy's like a guitar genius, and just,
And a
I don't know.
legend in death metal.
What's that?
And a legend in death metal.
Oh, of course, yeah, and I don't know that, he would be the type to ever, like Danny said when somebody suggested that he write a book. I don't know that Trey would ever be the type to kind of like sit down and do it, but he probably has a very interesting story to tell. And I mean, he's somebody who I've just admired for many years and would love to meet and talk to for that long.
Yeah, I agree. I've only met Trey a couple times and he was like chill as fuck.
yeah, he's cool, dude.
Hell yeah. Yeah, and sort of in the end to sort of wrap things up. I guess for you Dan, because I know you've have like kept busy with like a bunch of bands and projects over the years. It's just anything that is like upcoming for to that you're allowed to plug for this if that in terms of like new music and stuff.
Nothing really concrete. I might jam with a couple of my bros in the area and do some nice brutal stuff that would just be more for fun as far as playing locally, no big ambitions, going on tour, doing records or any crap like that. If that takes more of a shape, then, I would get it out to people, but it would be a little premature right now to, say that I have something together that's worth announcing. But I'm gonna get bored eventually and want to do something. And as long as it can be nice and low maintenance like that, then yeah,
Yeah.
something will eventually materialize.
Yeah. And I guess like for you, Dave, is just any other books that are in the works?
Nah, this was like a labor of love. We didn't do like the kind of traditional book route or whatever, where you get an agent and like send it out. And, we just started putting it together and, leaned on our network, and it was eventually published. I am not opposed to maybe doing something, but, I don't know that I have the energy to work on something for like 6 years. That's a maybe. So no is the short answer on that one.
All right. But thank you guys for this conversation. It's great to be able to talk with y'all. There's just any final words you want to say to sort of close this out?
I guess what I would say is what I usually say, which is just to express my appreciation to all the people out there. Not saying buy the book. I'm just saying if you're watching this, then you've been supporting metal for years, underground metal, not just stuff that I've done. So, just fucking horns up to all the people who keep making this happen. Because if it wasn't for you guys, then nobody would give a shit.
Yeah. And for you, Dave?
I mean, I would just echo Dan's statements that I don't know, we appreciate any support. And I am a lifelong metal fan, and like I said, this was a labor of love. And the second edition's like a DIY effort, just to get it back out there to people. And I'll do the shameless plug and say that if you want to order it, it's just the title of the book, perpetualconversion.com, and I will send you a copy from Chicago.
Awesome. So everybody, Dan Lilker and Dave Hofer, we'll see you next time.